Great. So we've just been told that we are live here for this session. I just wanted to, before giving the floor to our speakers, thank you very much on behalf of ELC. And for those listening, just to give you a little bit of context, this project was developed, the LLL sessions, Lesbians in Lockdown Listening, was developed in the midst of COVID to create some shared space to talk about our experiences. And they very interestingly developed into Lesbian Genius Talks. And I want to announce that we are recording every one of our Lesbian Genius Talks, which you can find on our website. And that being said, I'm now gonna hand the floor to Karin to introduce herself as well as the other speakers, and wishing everyone a wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leila. Hi, my name is Karin. And I'm a feminist economist from Austria. I'm based in Vienna and stuck in Vienna at the moment. And I've been thinking about the corona crisis also as an economic crisis. And I've been discussing it with my students. I teach economics at the University of Vienna. And I've also been doing some research on the crisis, as I think there are some very interesting economic aspects to look at, and also to look at from the point of view of lesbian economics and feminist economics. So I'm very, very happy today to have two wonderful speakers join me. There is Lee Badgett. Hello, Lee.
Good morning for me.
Would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Lee Badgett. I'm also a feminist economist. I study labor markets and in particular focus on LGBT people's economic situations in the US and in some cases other countries. And I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Oh, actually, I should say I'm at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, which is west of Boston. North of New York City, and also work with the Williams Institute at UCLA out in California.
Thank you very much. An interesting place to be right now. We will be hearing from you a lot more about how it is in the US right now, I assume. Thanks for now. And our third speaker is Moira Suyarkulova from Kyrgyzstan. Hi, Moira, can you hear me? Hello? Have we lost Moira?
You hear me?
Yes, now I see you and I hear you. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Oh, so yeah, my name is Moira Suyarkulova. I'm a feminist and a queer communist. I'm a scholar of Central Asian politics, and I also research and teach on gender and sexuality. I'm based here in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And I'm an associate professor at the American University of Central Asia here. So looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Karin, for initiating it.
Thank you so much for joining me and joining us in this discussion. And we have a good hour time to talk about lesbian lives in the global economic crisis that is facing us right now. So I want to break this into two parts. And the first part will be more in the short run, like what has happened since this virus has come over us, and how have lesbian women especially been affected. And we will talk about the different perspectives from our position, like Europe, the US, and Central Asia. And then I want to talk in the second block, I would like us to talk about what's going to happen, what do we think is going to happen, because everybody's talking about this global economic crisis coming. So let's start in the short run. And I would like to do it like this, that first the three of us give a little input, and then we'll open the floor to the people listening in. I have no idea how that is going to work technically, but I hope the listeners can also say stuff. So let's just start. And who would like to start, Lee or Moira? I'll just start with the question and then you can volunteer. Okay, so the first part in the short run. since we have experienced this economic, the Corona crisis since, mostly January, February, March. So how, or let me ask even differently, are lesbians affected different than other people by this global pandemic? Are they? And if so, how are they affected differently than the general population? And then it would be interesting to compare, is it the same everywhere? And just like for the short time in those last 2-3 months, have lesbians been affected differently, and how so? So who wants to go? Lei? Moira?
I'll give it a try. I thought you were going to go first, actually, but
no,
can you hear me?
Yeah. I struggle voicing the question. So
all right. Well, that's the kind of the big question. In some ways, I'm not sure it really matters if it's better or worse, because nobody's doing very well right now, really. And I'll just apologize in advance. My dog is here in the room and making strange noises because he's a dog. So there's a big problem that we're facing with being able to answer that question here in the US, which is that we don't really have any data on what's happening to LGBT people in real time. There have been some people who, there have been a couple of surveys that have been done, and it does suggest that people are certainly suffering the same kinds of problems that everybody has, having to stay home, sometimes losing jobs, having to go on unemployment, and facing health issues. So in some ways, I think it's going to be pretty similar. But if we kind of take a step back and think about what we are likely to be looking at, I think that there's several reasons to think that lesbians might be hit worse. And actually a lot of these things will also be relevant for bisexual women, certainly for transgender people, and in some cases, at least for gay men as well. So here's the situation when this whole crisis started. Things were not good, right? We knew there was economic inequality for LGBT people and for lesbians. All of the surveys done on the eve of the crisis showed, that people were in vulnerable positions, at least as vulnerable, and certainly for lesbians and bisexual and transgender people, definitely feeling more vulnerable financially at the end of 2019. Our Federal Reserve Board actually did this great study that, to my surprise, they included a question on being LGBT. So we can actually see that in late 2019. So there's every reason to think that things are probably worse for LGBT people because of that. Being more financially vulnerable, number one. Number two, having health conditions that will make them particularly susceptible to COVID-19, to other kinds of illnesses, because there's a lot of research in the US and around the world about health disparities for LGBT people. So there's health disparities that will maybe make the pandemic worse. The other thing is that for lesbians compared to other parts of the LGBT community, they are much more likely to have children. So what's happening now to people with kids, they're actually having to, in the US, we're still mostly at home, being asked to stay home, and most of the schools are closed. They'd be closing now anyway, but for several months now, lesbians who have kids have had them in their homes. They've had to deal with homeschooling. They've had to deal with providing childcare 24/7, and in many cases having to work at the same time or to figure out how they're going to get by financially. So this is something that I think is going to be more common for lesbians and bisexual women than it will be for other parts of the LGBT community. And so it kind of puts lesbians in the same hard position that other women in the United States are in. They're also likely to be in, many of them may be working in jobs where they're being asked to continue to work in certain kinds of caring professions, or retail sector jobs where they're still being exposed to the virus. So in the short run, what we can piece together and what anecdotal life suggests is that lesbians are having at least as hard a time as everyone else, if not harder.
Thank you very much, Lee. Yeah. All right. Let's hear from Moira. How is it going in Kyrgyzstan? Do you see any specific effects for lesbian women, or is it all the same, or is it really hard for everyone? We don't get any news from that region at all at the moment, I'm afraid. So very interesting to us what you have to say.
So because I'm involved with LGBT activism here, we've actually conducted a little survey when the epidemic reached Kyrgyzstan and the government introduced a state of emergency, and we were on a strict lockdown, we had curfew. So we immediately conducted a survey among LGBT people to assess the needs and to find out what the challenges are. So immediately we realized that, you know, the demand to stay at home, which is supposedly a safe place, may be the toughest challenge for a lot of queer people. So generally, we know from the past experience that whenever there's a long holiday, for instance, that levels of domestic violence go up. Right. So in January, when we had long holidays, several women were killed. So similarly, you know, for queer people being forced to stay at home with homophobic relatives or parents can be dangerous. We actually have seen 65, according to the official data, there was a 65% increase in domestic violence figures here in Kyrgyzstan during the lockdown. There was a significant increase in number of teenage suicides, also due to abuse from parents and relatives. So also the survey revealed that people were having financial trouble, people were facing food insecurity, because a lot of people, women especially, are employed in the informal sector, and they paid daily wages. The other thing is that women also are the majority of the healthcare workers in Kyrgyzstan. So they also face disproportionate risks of being infected. And also, of course, their working conditions were quite horrible. So on so many different levels, we see that basically this crisis revealed all these structural kind of problems that we've been talking about for decades, right? As a feminist and queer movement, these are not news to us, and we know that all these injustices and inequalities, they're not a bug; they're the feature of the system, right? For Central Asia, especially, I guess one of the biggest impacts, which we are yet to see, is the impact on the migrant workers, right? So in about 1 million of Kyrgyzstanis, so the total population of Kyrgyzstan is about 6 million, and about 1 million. So every 1 in 6 Kyrgyzstanis are migrant workers who who live seasonally or for extended periods of time abroad, mostly in Russia, as all kinds of workers. And half of these workers are women. And of course, LGBT people also have specificity about their migration, right? So like everybody else, they're workers, but they might have also other reasons to want to migrate. So yeah, a lot of migrant workers have been either stuck in Russia during this period, or they've been traveling overland and trying to cross the borders through Kazakhstan on land because all the international flights were stopped. The government organized a few charter flights, but yeah, like it's still quite a few people who are stuck without work. They live in crowded conditions. They're also usually informally employed waged workers. Yeah, who are getting daily wages. So yeah, all of these are kind of the prominent factors. And so, like, you know, all these like kind of major things like, you know, the exchange rates for dollar and oil prices, because 30% of Kyrgyzstan's GDP is constituted by overseas remittances, yeah, from the migrant workers. Yeah, so the oil prices, of course, in Russia are going to affect it. You know, the dollar exchange rate, because that's the currency that people use to save money and to send money home. All of that's going to affect people's livelihoods in the months to come. So yeah, so that's briefly what's happening here.
Wow, thank you so much, Moira. That is super, super interesting, really very interesting. And it all links us together. You just mentioned the dollar price and the oil price. The dollar prices, you know, depending on what is happening in the US now, the race, let's call it the riots as they're called here, they're going to influence the dollar prices. The president going to fall, what's going to happen, you know, all these things, they're all tied together. Before we get to this, I want to finish this little round by giving a very brief glimpse of what has been happening in Europe from the perspective of Austria. And I can resonate with many things that Lee said and also that Moira said. Staying at home has been a problem. I've been talking to a lot of my students. I'm teaching international students at the development department in Vienna. And a lot of them had to go home because the places where they were staying were shut. And my students were calling in from, you know, the Ukraine and saying they had to live with their parents and they're not feeling very good to be there. And this violence in the family, it's, I think, more intergenerational for the queer population. If you have to go home to your parents, that's not so nice. And imagine you can't leave again. Usually you visit them and you go. So that was really hard, but because they're financially dependent on the parents, they don't have jobs. Or we also had huge problems for the students with their students' jobs closing down because they're in the service industry, they're waiters and stuff like that. So they couldn't do their jobs and then they couldn't pay their rents. And so they had to go home. So the students have been calling for the student fees to be canceled for the semester or the whole semester to be canceled. So this, it's also has to do, how old are you if you're a lesbian woman who's faced with this crisis? Another thing, especially if you're young or if you're homeless, is in Austria, there was a huge problem. Where can you go? We had a very strict lockdown and homeless people could only sleep in the centers where they could go. But during the day, they have to be outside. And so they were walking the streets of the city, but they're not allowed to sit down or anything. So it was a huge problem for homeless people. And there are some homeless lesbian women in Vienna. And so it's really, and it's also very dangerous. The police harasses you. And also if you're out there, it's not a good climate. Of course, that is connected to all our places have been shut down. The bars have been shut down, the venues, the counseling centers, everything had to be shut. So where do you go? Most of the times, even the phone lines were shut. There was nobody running internet counseling because people are volunteers. So this is, you know, all of a sudden the places disappear. And now since about 2 weeks in Austria, you're allowed to go back into bars and cafes, and people are not really coming back because you don't want to be inside in a bar. The weather is not so good if there's a garden to be outside. So it's, I really see the meeting places are disappearing. That's very, very sad and also scary. If you can't meet, you can't be politically active together, which is quite necessary. So how do we keep our places alive? How do we keep our bars alive? Just, you can't drink as much as you would need to give them the money. Yes, and then on a you also have to see, not just the young people, the older lesbians sometimes, just think about it. A lot of people, if you're not in a couple, if you don't live together, our relationships, they're not recognized. So you're not allowed to visit your girlfriend because you're not married or anything. So if you haven't been smart enough to get married, you have been really in trouble in this crisis. So you have to depend on a network. Who's going to bring you food, especially for the older women. They're usually not so close with parents and families like this. So that could be a problem, especially if you get sick. Who's going to look out for you? And then another problem that we saw here was connected what you also said, this informal work. And we have had, now it's called the clusters, COVID clusters, and they pop up as in the sectors where there are temp workers, where there are no good contracts. When people stay at home, they don't get paid, so they are forced to go into the work. And often in Vienna, it's been that these people are working in the transport or in the logistics centers. So the postal service has been greatly disrupted because the postal center had been shut down, and post was done by the military, who was taking care of the post. It was really strange. And a lot of the workers, the temp workers, were actually living in refugee homes because they had access to bad jobs like this. And so the refugee population was especially endangered by this, temp work that gives you bad working conditions, and then you get sick, and then you go home to the asylum center where you live with lots of people. It's really a big problem. And finally, I think what we have seen here is that some governments have been really using this crisis against the LGBT community. If you look at Hungary, all of a sudden it's becoming illegal to be transgender because, the Orban regime has put in emergency measures, and now they're trying to push through whatever they think is appropriate. The same problem, or a similar problem, we're seeing in Poland, where, the LGBT-free zones, and in this crisis and with lockdown, these governments are going to try to see how they can use this for making things very unfriendly for us. So I think we have to be very careful. And all this with financial interdependence and discrimination and global politics, it's a very, dangerous moment, I think. Okay, before it gets too depressing here,
Can I ask a couple of things? It made me think about something I wanted to ask you about. So actually, one thing I wanted to say was a group called Outright International. It's based in New York, but it's works with activists all over the world. They've done a really excellent report. I think they talked to people in 35, 40 different countries to get a quick idea about what's happening. And I think that many of the things that we've been talking about here are being experienced in different places as well. So that's interesting and an important resource. But the question that I had for you, I'm curious, Karin, you mentioned supporting our bars and that sort of thing, but what about our organizations? I know in the US, a lot of LGBT groups are laying people off right now. They're hanging on by the skin of their teeth. The ones that count on conferences have had to cancel them and kind of move things online, pride events, all these sorts of things. I think it's gonna, it's hard to know. It could be completely, apocalyptic with regard to a lot of these groups. What do things look like in Kyrgyzstan and Austria?
Moira, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Like you said, Karin, this crisis always, it presents risks, right? It can be dangerous moment, can also be a moment of opportunity. So the government has been using the pretext of the pandemic to basically try to limit the work of LGBT organizations and feminist organizations, and generally civil society and activism. So even before the state of emergency was declared in March, they tried to use the pretext of the epidemic to ban Women's March on the 8th of March. right? So I was one of the organizers. And so, yeah, basically they tried to ban our peaceful march through a court. And, you know, us and several other groups, including trade unions, were appealing that decision. And then we were attacked on the day of the march and detained by the police, whereas our attackers were not. So we can see that, I mean, this has been happening for several years now, that there's like a systematic state attempt to intimidate and basically bully activists and harass. But also during this time, during the state of emergency, the parliament started hearings on a draft law that demands extra financial accountability from NGOs, right? So this is targeting also feminists and LGBT NGOs and others, you know, like crisis centers for women, shelters, everyone who receives foreign funding, basically. So it's kind of styled after that law that they introduced in Russia about foreign agents, right? So it is basically it's a discriminatory law that, yeah, targets activists. And so they're trying to do it now, or they were a few weeks ago, because, you know, the representatives of civil society could not attend the hearing, so they were not going through the due process with the, you know, public consultation and all of that. Yeah, so so this is also a threat to our work. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add on this.
Well, thank you for that. Yes, a lot of what you're saying, and like not as drastic, has been going on in Austria too. I mean, now we have the Green Party in the government, which promises to, you know, block a lot of the harshest things. And then one thing that has been good for us compared to the US, where a lot of people are employed in LGBTI organizations, in Austria, there are not many jobs. Like, a lot of the work we're doing is still volunteer work. So the counseling and the activists, they're not being paid anyway. Like, most people are not being paid. Our organizations are largely fully volunteer. So if we're losing employees per se, that would not be so bad. But of course, we have the funding for the spaces and the places and the infrastructure. Yes, but it reminds me a little bit of the 80s, where, you know, students were a little bit less stressed in their time where they were at the university, and where people weren't working all the time, and you had more time at your hand to do volunteer work. And now with many people losing their jobs and being unemployed, I see there being greater resources for volunteers to actually work. So that might be a good thing, because Moira, you said we shouldn't only look on the bad side. Yes, so that we have time resources now might be a good thing, but we have to be careful with the funding that we do need for our work. And we will see how that continues. And it really depends on the government policy, what is going to happen, you know, in the future to this crisis. Yes, I see there are coming questions in, so I want to open up to the audience, and please ask us any questions that we can hopefully answer. And also, please share with us what has been happening in your country, or where you are, or where you have made interesting observations, or what would you just like to share with us? How has been the economic effects of Corona for lesbian women where you are? Any questions? Any comments?
There's a question from Lada in chat.
Yeah, can you see it? It just zoomed by me. It was something about the euro.
Just click
right?
on it. Yeah, click on it. Here, I'll read it to you. The
Yes,
euro is
please.
falling rapidly now. Do you know what it means for Europe and for vulnerable people there?
Yes, the euro is falling rapidly. I don't think it's falling that rapidly. It actually looks like it's coming up again. I'm looking at the data as of today, and it looks like just recently the euro has been going up compared to the dollar, you know. So at this point, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to say what is happening with the currencies, right? Because I've been very, very surprised and also puzzled by the fact that the dollar wouldn't fall, right? In the last time, you know, with all the oil being out there, remember the oil was on all these ships and sailing around the world. Nobody wanted oil, and the oil price went negative, and there was all this oil, and usually people want dollars to buy oil, but because nobody wanted to buy the oil, nobody wanted the dollars. So why didn't the dollar crash? I'm not understanding. Lee, you're a real economist. Maybe you know.
Not really my field, but it's also true that, you know, we've had this weird stock market phenomenon where it, you know, tanks and comes back up and tanks and comes back up. And so, you know, there's still a desire, I think, a demand for the dollar to buy those securities, to buy treasury bills, sort of things that are seen as being stable in tough times. I mean, I think that's something that we've seen in the past during kind of, but
I was just thinking maybe it's the monetary policy of the US, and they're like frantically, you know, buying up the dollars to keep the dollar price, you know, stable. So I've been wondering how much is there still left, you know, with US reserves.
They're pumping liquidity into the system, right? So that's the Fed's role in all of this. And so that should mean there are lots of dollars out there for people who want them. What, you know, what impact that will have on the exchange rate is beyond my area of economics.
Yeah, and then it's all like a crime story. Has Trump now hijacked the Fed? Is he really telling them what to do? I mean, the national bank is supposedly independent of the government, but they're saying Trump has now put his foot into the Fed.
He would like to be able to, but they do have that degree of independence that keeps him from easily manipulating it.
I mean, generally, you have to say, like, if your currency is going down a little bit, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because in economic theory, you know, if your currency is weaker, then you can export your stuff.
Right.
Better.
But but Donald Trump wants the dollar to be strong. It's like a symbol for him. He doesn't understand economics, so and what that means.
I mean, for Austria, it's different. If the euro gets weaker, we would be happy because our largest export is tourism. So we're thinking it's really cheap for people now to come and have holidays in Austria. But nobody wants to go on holidays to Austria. We had this scandal with the Tyrol, where all of Iceland, who has the coronavirus now, got it in Tyrol in Austria, which is not such good advertisement for the tourism. So the euro falling, I don't see it falling right now. It fell since, I think, 2018, but now it looks like it's coming up again. So I wouldn't worry too much about the euro. I would worry more about the dollar at this moment.
Yeah, then, we are very worried about the dollar here, because it very sharply went up, and you know, it's a reserve currency for the rest of the world. It's not, it's like how people save money everywhere in the world, right? And I think I read this fact a few years ago, that most of the paper dollars in circulation are actually abroad. They are outside of US, because that's how people stash money. So when there's a crisis, its value goes up. But for instance, for me personally, my salary is fixed in dollars, but I am paid in a local currency in Kyrgyzstan. So I've actually lost real earnings this year. significantly, and probably so did many other people. And so, for instance, my rent price is also fixed in dollars, but I get paid in Kyrgyzstan. So this definitely affects a lot of people all over the world.
Yes, my friend from Pakistan has been telling me the same. He's sending home the money to his family in Pakistan, and it all depends on the price of the dollar, how much they're actually getting. And a lot of the dollars are, of course, stuck in China. So this is the great question mark in global economics. What is happening in China? What will China decide to do? So that is a very, very interesting field of speculations, because if China decides we don't want all these US dollars anymore and let's go of them, then the dollar will be worth nothing. So it's really a very powerful position that China is in, but Trump, of course, does not realize that at all. The great worry. Do we have any more questions from the audience? What's going on in your country with lesbians and the Corona crisis?
There are. Say something.
Yes, please.
Hello. Hello, I'm Vlada Thor. I don't want to switch on my video. I'm so sorry. I didn't prepare for this. I'm currently live in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and my question about falling euro was also about that. Depends to ruble. Euro is falling rapidly, very, very fast, and for us here, it means for us as activists, for example, it means that our, for example, grants or our money that we receive for our job in euro, it's so much less than usual. So usually we feel very good feelings when euro up, because it means that in Russia, in rubles, we will receive more money. But and I asked about Europe because I want to move when I will be able. And do you think that it's okay for Europe, right? If this situation will go further and euro will be, how to say, falling to others, how to say, ruble and other money.
Okay. So why is the euro losing value compared to the ruble is your question, right?
Yes, and how it influences Europe. If it's not, it's okay. But I'm not an economist, and my question was if it is, because it's very interesting for me personally, I just would know. And I wanted to send some picture about some graphic, but I cannot. Zoom doesn't provide this kind of thing.
Okay. I'm not really an expert on Russia, so I don't know exactly what is happening in Russia, but are you sure that the euro is falling compared to the ruble? Are you really sure?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay.
Absolutely. We lose every day. Like.
Oh my God. Okay. Yeah. I just pulled up a chart. Yes. Since March.
Looks like there was a big dip in March, right?
March 19 seems to be the turning point. Oh yeah. Why is this happening?
Early March, late February.
I don't know. I wanted to ask you, because for me, a very interesting thing, maybe, I don't know why, maybe because of, how to say, neft. Mahira, can you help me? Oil, yeah. Right.
Oil, yeah,
Ah,
yeah,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yeah. That's about when the oil price started to fall. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I
So
mean,
it's okay
this
for Europe, right?
the,
It's not kind of thing that if I want to move to Europe, I have to worry about what's going on, what I'm seeing what's going on with Euro.
yeah. No, I mean, you shouldn't worry about Europe, I think. So that's the the thing is like that I found interesting is why was the oil price going crazy? I mean, a negative oil price, that's insane, you know, for economists, that's insane. You always worried the oil price would be too high. In 2009, me and my colleagues here at the institute where I work, we predicted the oil price would be $200 per barrel, now. And then all of a sudden it's zero, don't tell anyone that we make these predictions. But the interesting thing is, why is the oil price so low? And the oil price is so low because of the fracking industry in the US. Because rather than being somebody who needs to fight all these wars in the Middle East to import the oil, the US has started to frack, and fracking is a horrible process that washes out the oil from the tar sands with chemicals and pressure and all this, and it literally destroys all the world, like the nature and the landscape and the drinking water, and it's like a huge destruction. But fracking has been very, very profitable because it has been cheap enough, and because so much oil was fracked that the price went down to $30-40 per barrel for the last 2 years, let's say, no? And that was horrible because Russia has been speculating on, having gas, large amounts of gas, and that the industry would change from oil to gas more like this. And then, in the weeks just before the Corona crisis got really bad, there was this price war with Russia and Saudi Arabia. And they were trying to, it was like a chicken game, we're going to drive against each other and letting the oil price go down and down and down, and who's going to, budge, right? Yeah. And the good thing is that a lot of fracking companies went out of business because they're not sustainable below $40-50 per barrel. So that's really good because that's preserving the nature, right? So, and I think as lesbian activists, we also have to be future looking and then wonder, be in solidarity with usually it's native land, like Native Americans or, indigenous people everywhere. These lands are being destroyed by production processes like fracking or mining or all this. We see the same story in Australia. And so I think it's really important as social activists with a future agenda to come together and try to prevent these really unsustainable, destructive production processes, not just because of the economic effects, currencies going up and down and prices and so on, so falling. But the problem with the capitalist economy as we have it, that things like this are not put into the price process. You're not paying it for your car when you get the petrol. You're not paying for the destruction of the environment that will never be able to be fixed again. So that is very important, and I think we should try to talk about things like this. Lee, you're trying to say something. I can see it.
Well, no, I mean, I'm just sort of nodding along. I mean, well, Hira said something about the value of, rethinking things during this crisis. And I think, this is one of those examples where, whenever we have a really bad deep recession, people just buy less oil anyway. So that's also part of the problem. But we're buying less oil because we're driving less. We drive less, so air quality is better. We can see stars in places that you couldn't see before because the light pollution has gone down. Things are quieter, so we're in a really weird, creepy kind of way where we're kind of seeing the world that we want to get back to, if we are able to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels so that the environment, we can reverse things there. That's going to be hard though, because we can see you can do that at a tremendous cost to human life and human suffering. There's got to be a better way, right? I mean, there's all sorts of better ways with, renewable energy sources and that sort of thing. But that's, I think, your point about putting all of these issues together is a really important
one. Yeah, Moira, did you want to say something about that?
Another thing that capitalist economics does not take into account that feminists have been talking about is, of course, the reproductive labor, right? All the care that usually women provide. And this is especially important to recognize now, during this crisis. But, feminists have been talking about this crisis of care for a very long time, right? We have deficit of care, and this is again, like, this is the feature, not the bug, right? It's kind of like what is being exploited, what is being mystified, as a natural resource or some kind of labor of love, they say, It's like personal service that women do, but it's kind of what recreates the labor force. That's what what the whole economy stands on. And I think this has become very apparent. Also, how we're all vulnerable, and how we cannot have this society where your survival depends on your ability to work, right? Especially, for instance, in the United States, where access to healthcare is premised on your employment, right? And just generally, your ability to survive, to have shelter, right? To have food, to have healthcare, all the other things that are necessary for decent life. They're all determined by your ability to work. So we've been talking also here in Central Asia with Feminita and other activists about this sick woman theory, right? Which basically, underscores this feminist ethic of care and politicizes care. And of course, this has been a very long-standing feminist issue, right? From 70s, at least. So for instance, like we see in some countries, governments making direct payments to people. Or like in Spain, they introduced universal basic income. And I think that should become part of our activism. It should be on our agenda as LGBT activists, as lesbian activists. So that's kind of the opportunity of the crisis. I think that the optimistic take.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, also, like the governments, what the national governments are doing. I mean, in Europe, we have the European Union that has been behaving quite surprisingly. And I was having a very optimistic moment one week and a half ago when Merkel and the French president and the German president, when they said we will do a common fiscal policy, which would finally bring the European Union together to be an economic unit. And they announced that they would spend a lot of money and do projects in the countries like Italy, Spain, that were hit hardest by the corona crisis. And then, of course, the Austrian government, together with 3 other governments, said, no, we don't want that. It's better to give, loans to these countries. I mean, how are they ever going to be able to pay back more loans? It's impossible. And this was really a sad moment, because I think the chance of Europe coming together closer and finally, being more equal and more just within all these countries, that has been lost again. So that's not a good thing. Meanwhile, I have looked a little bit at the ruble and the euro to answer your question, Vlada, and I think the price effect we're seeing now is because of the loss of the oil price. a lot of people wanted to sell their rubles, and the Russian central bank wanted to prevent that. And they have said that you cannot buy any foreign currencies right now. And this is why the price has gone up. So it's artificial, you know, don't worry about it. It's got nothing really to do with the economy. It's just the Russian central bank wants to prevent that everybody tries to sell the ruble, which would bring the ruble down very quickly. I can send you a link to this later if you want. So, but let's go back to the great optimism. I think I've been thinking about what we can do, and especially as you know, the ELC and the activist networks trying to work together. I think it's interesting to think about, on the one hand, strengthen our networks during the crisis. And that's why I'm so grateful for ELC to open these forums that we can talk to each other all across the world with someone from Kyrgyzstan and from the US and from Russia. And I have no idea who else is out there right now. So I think that is really great, and that we actually learn to connect with this lockdown and to have these digital conversations at least. And that it's maybe good that we can't fly all over the place and meet in person and so on and so on. And we should relearn how to do this, I guess. Of course, it is a great danger if the poor countries will be even more indebted, and you know, if we don't succeed in having, now it would be a good time to have a global vision with degrowth rather than everybody waiting for things going back to normal. Do you think that's going to happen? Are we going to have a broader vision of degrowth and less pollutants and eventually inequality leveling out because we were going to tax the rich? And with those taxes from the rich, we're going to do sustainable, clean environmental policy. What do you think? Oh dear, it's only gloom and doom.
I don't know. You want to go first? I don't feel that optimistic about it. I do feel like it is a moment, you know, where we can imagine that. And that's really important because, I mean, Karin, you write about utopias. If you can't imagine it, you know, we don't know what we're trying to get to. And so I think that is really important and a very positive thing. And in the US, we're seeing, you know, people with new ideas being elected to office, to our Congress, for example. You know, there are more voices with these ideas. It's going to be hard though, because I think what we're seeing in the US is a lot of pain, a lot of suffering that's, you know, historical with African Americans and our history of slavery and how it's embedded in our institutions. And it's, you know, it's taking centuries to work through that. We still clearly have such a long way to go. And we can see in the response to the protests that there is a side that's going to resist change very, very firmly. And we're seeing that in some of the other countries that you've mentioned. So it's not, there's no easy path to that. There's no easy path to that. But I would also love to see LGBT people being part of that conversation and rethinking how we make our economies better for everybody. And it will make our lives better for sure.
Yeah, you talk a lot with people in the so-called Global South League in your work.
Some. Mm-hmm.
How do you think we can strengthen our solidarity with lesbians in Uganda or other groups that you've been visiting in India?
Yeah.
No, you didn't go to India last year because you got sick. But,
no. Well, I think we do it by building relationships any way we can and working together on things. And I think that's how I've gotten to know some people where we're working towards the same goal, you know, maybe through the UN Development Program and the LGBT Inclusion Index is, you know, an example of something where I've gotten to know people and to build those sorts of relationships. You know, it may happen, you know, you and I got to know each other through an international organization. So it's hard to do. And, you know, the irony is a lot of times that happens at the cost to our environment when we all get on airplanes and go somewhere. So that's really the big challenge, I think.
Hmm. Yeah. Moira, do you want to say something optimistic or not optimistic about the greater future?
So less optimistic take is, of course, we know that capitalism has been very resilient, and it has been actually able to, take the crisis and basically, I've been reading Silvia Federici, and then she talks about primitive accumulation. So this historical process of like enclosures, right? That was like the original sin of capitalism. Yeah, the way that people were deprived of their lands and became proletariat. But she says this has been the permanent condition, basically. So every time there's a crisis, more and more people are being, impoverished, criminalized. Yeah, we see, for instance, persecution of migrant workers. We see violence against women and LGBT people. So all of those mechanisms are used to make people desperate and disempower them so that they are more easily exploitable. So unfortunately, I see it as a likely scenario for people from my region, who, as I mentioned, are often migrant workers, yeah, or like people who work in an informal sector, not unionized, just, yeah, very precarious workers. Yeah, and Kyrgyzstan has taken out a few loans recently, or was given by the global financial institutions to tackle the epidemic. So I don't know what that, because there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of abuse of power happening here. It is likely that our lives are going to become harder here, and that we as activists, we're going to also face additional challenges in the coming months and then possibly years.
Okay.
Karin, sorry.
Yes, I heard you. Can I just, yeah?
It's just to tell you, from the Facebook Live, you were wondering from which countries people were connecting. So there are people who are in Netherlands, in Kyrgyzstan, in Germany, in France, in Dublin, some people from Turkey. So there are a lot of different countries which are listening to what you are saying. And there is one question or a contribution from Zanar, from Kazakhstan, and Zanar is saying activism we do and try to develop was not including economic stability. After coronavirus situation, perhaps we should think more about stability and employment, and develop such and implement such projects.
Hey, thank you very much. This is great feedback. Thank you. It's nearly 5 o'clock, I see, in Vienna. So I'm going to try to wrap this up a little bit. One good thing about the debt that Moira was mentioning, just reading today that the G7, interestingly enough, Trump doesn't like the G7 anymore, but they are now thinking there should be a debt moratorium for those poor countries who have to take up more loans. I mean, the G7 are offering to cancel a lot of this debt. The same with the IMF boss. She said also that there should be a debt restructuring. So the most powerful institutions are currently saying we cannot increase this debt. So I'm hoping that that will be a good start. I mean, the very interesting thing of this crisis is, where is all this money coming from? And it's basically just money that's invented, and everybody's inventing this money, which basically means that they're just printing all this money, which is for economists a total no. You're not supposed to just print money, because that will just be inflation at the end of the economy. But if everybody's doing that, we don't really know what's going to happen. This might be the end of the system, or it might just mean that money is quite, meaningless in the end. That's why it's easy to say we'll just restructure the debt. So this is a very interesting moment for financial market experts and for, monetary policy. And we really don't know what's going to happen. I mean, maybe Lee does. I don't. So that's an interesting field for utopian speculation. And I do think that we should try to come closer and with the international solidarity to look after each other in our projects, and be in close contact and talk with each other. And then try to get rid of those corrupt people, be it in Kyrgyzstan or being in the US or being in Europe, these conservative people who want to avoid a greater, integration of the wealthy people in the restructuring programs. So I think we need activity from all sides and solidarity with the vulnerable parts of our movements, the Black Lives Matters community that is also a lesbian community in some part, and the trans lesbians who are, when things are getting tough for those most vulnerable will suffer most. So be aware of those people and be there. I think that's what I'm saying now. And I did write a new little utopian essay, and maybe that will be published too. We will find out. Yes. That were my closing words. It's 2 minutes past 5. Unless somebody in the audience, the listeners from all the interesting places want to say something. There's moment, time for a statement, another question. Otherwise, we will be back. Yes, it's a little commercial now for the next time. Lee will be presenting her new book. The book came out just a few weeks ago, and she will be presenting that at the start of July, most likely on July 1st. So stay tuned for that. The book is called The Economic Case for LGBT Equality. And Lee will be telling you about that book next time in our wonderful economics session. And I hope to see you all again then, even though I didn't see anybody. It's a little strange to talk into this. Lee, did you want to say a final sentence? Moira, did you want to say something? Please, before I hand it over to Leila.
I'll just, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great.
Very interesting. Thank you, both of you. And I think we could talk much longer, but we shouldn't do it right now, I guess.
Thank you so much. Karin, thank you so much for initiating this session and moderating it as well. And Moira and Lee, thank you so much for joining. I found it extremely compelling. I just wanted to share also that from ELC's side, knowing that the crisis was influencing lesbian communities quite drastically across Europe and Central Asia, we've actually launched a sub-granting project, which you can find more about on our website. And one of the last questions was about, is this crisis gonna, can it perhaps influence the way we organize in the coming times? And to this, I want to say yes, at least from our perspective. We're already trying to imagine how we can create a greener conference for the 2021 edition. So that was like in broader strokes what we are doing related to the to economy and lesbians. And I also wanted to just finish off by plugging our next session, which is going to be on the 11th of June. And it's going to be focusing on resistance strategies and tools against police brutality, especially against the BIPOC community. So this is really our way of showing our solidarity and support to the Black Lives Matter movement. So that was it on our part. We're now going to end the Facebook Live. Thank you everyone from every corner of the world who joined. And again, thanks so much to Karin, Lee, and Moira for being with us today.
Thank you for helping us, Leila.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.